The Great Fire of London started by accident in a baker's shop in Pudding Lane, and that's where the monument now stands. A strong wind spread the flames quickly through the closely packed wooden houses. In the nearby jumble of streets was Frying Pan Alley. That's where my story begins, and I'm going to begin in the year 1870, for that was when Elizabeth Scopes got married. She married a young man who lived at the other side of the road. He was a young man with good prospects. He was a highly skilled craftsman who made watch parts. So great were his skills that people forecast that he had a great future ahead of him. They both came from large families. Most people did in those days. Elizabeth had a brother, Tom, who was determined to get away from the overcrowded conditions in his street. Living so close to the Thames, he marvelled at the tall ships that sailed the oceans of the world, and he listened to tales from seafarers who had crossed the Atlantic and who talked of the great developments and prospects of the New World. His imagination was stimulated. He, too, would like to sail across the mighty ocean to be part of the evolving nation at the other side of the Atlantic. And so he said goodbye to his sister Elizabeth and the rest of the family and the childhood friends he had played with, and he sailed to the new land. Arrived in the New World, he was amazed at the vastness of the continent. What should he do? Where should he settle? Some Mormons were assembling wagons and horses and provisions to cross the undeveloped interior to find a suitable place to settle. They knew there would be troubles ahead. They needed sturdy young men to look after a multitude of manual tasks and to defend the wagon train if necessary. Tom volunteered. And so he became part of the band of adventurers making their way westward, ever westward. Few people can realize the hardships involved in the stupendous journey. And those who survived the journey settled near a great salt lake in Utah. But Tom was not a Mormon, though this journey gave him a great respect for them. His religion in the East End of London had been centred at the parish church. The time came when he parted company with those Mormon pioneers and struck south through Kentucky till he reached Tennessee. He married a local lass and in due course raised a family. One of them, John, delighted them with his academic capabilities, went through college and became a teacher in the town of Dayton, and became respected by the families whose children he taught. Better educated than most, although he was only in his mid-20s, people often sought his opinion on current issues. But this was the Bible Belt country, and Darwin's book on the origin of species was becoming a major topic in England and America and far beyond. In a region which, by tradition, believed every word of the Bible was true, this book was causing quite a stir. Feelings against the new theories of science were causing much concern in Kentucky and Tennessee. Feelings became so strong that in March 1925, a Tennessee legislator named Butler sponsored an act which made it illegal to teach the theory of evolution in state public schools. This created an immediate problem. The standard school textbook used for teaching biology in the schools was called civic biology, and John T. Scopes was now the science teacher at the Ree County High School. And one day he was approached to give an opinion, and the question he was asked was, did he think he could teach biology without mentioning evolution? Being an honest man, he gave a negative answer. No, it's not possible, he said. He was then accused of breaking the law. 4 days later, the local county jury met and indicted him for violating the Butler Act. A famous congressman named Bryan was brought in to head the prosecution. On hearing of the predicament of the young teacher, a famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow, offered to defend the teacher without charging a fee. And so began one of the most famous trials in human history, which attracted the attention of the whole world. It came to be known as the Monkeyville case of Dayton, Tennessee. The trial took place in the sweltering heat of July 1925. For the first time in United States history, and presumably world history, microphones were set up in court in order to broadcast proceedings throughout the whole United States. Famous lawyers of the day battled it out in intense heat. And at the end, Tom Scopes was eventually found guilty by what appeared to have been a fixed jury. But he never had to serve a prison sentence because of an appeal to higher legal authority which overturned the verdict. But nevertheless, he had to resign his teaching post. In a famous film which was made about it some years later, the atmosphere of the courtroom was recaptured by Spencer Tracy and other actors in the film Inherit the Wind. I have a copy of the stage play at home. Meanwhile, back in England, by this time, Elizabeth, who I mentioned, his aunt, was emerging from years of great distress. The man she had married with such high hopes had succumbed to drink, and with 10 children, she'd had to become the breadwinner. You may be wondering why I'm so interested in the Scopes family. Well, the Elizabeth Scopes I mentioned at the beginning married my grandfather, Henry Musgrave. The two families had grown up together in those Victorian days in Frying Pan Alley. Despite the controversy which the Monkeyville case may have stirred up, I have it on the authority of my grandmother that the Scopes were actually quite religious people. And I can well remember the family gathering in Islington when I was a small boy, when Tom Scopes, her brother and pioneer of the wagon days, came back to pay a visit to the scenes of his childhood and to meet his English relatives and friends. And I remember sitting on his knee and being told not to venture too deeply into science. And a few years later, John, who was at the centre of that famous trial in Tennessee, also came over to visit. And I still have the photograph of the family gathering with the world-famous John T. Scopes of Dayton, Tennessee.